So welcome everybody to, yes, HCN Live, the latest live conversation with the people who produce High Country News. My name is Greg Hanscom. I am the Executive Director and Publisher of High Country News, and I'm joining you from the High Country News headquarters building in Paonia, Colorado. Thanks so much for everyone who's tossed their whereabouts and messages into the chat. We've got people joining us today from all over the Western United States and even beyond. It's great to have you. I'll kind of kick this off and I'll introduce our guests in just a moment. But just so you know, if you're just joining us, you can see and hear us, I hope, but we cannot see or hear you. So you're safe to tune in your pajamas or your dirty jeans or whatever you're wearing today. We're none the wiser. If you do want to ask a question or send a message to us, you can do so in the chat. So we're getting the chats and we can see those. So thanks for your notes. HCN Live is backed by popular demand. This is something that we really started it last year, but really got into it last fall. This is a service for High Country News contributors, folks who support High Country News with a donation above and beyond the cost of a subscription. Maybe you give $5, maybe you give $5,000. This is really what keeps High Country News kicking. We're a reader-supported nonprofit, and we could not do what we do without you. So thank you so much for joining, and thank you so much for your support. Really appreciate it. I am here today to talk a little bit about the green energy transition and how that is playing out across the West, and whether we can avoid some of the pitfalls and problems that the West has seen with previous energy transitions. I am here with longtime High Country News contributing editor Jonathan Thompson. Welcome, Jonathan. Jonathan's done a ton of reporting on these topics over the years. And Sarah Sachs. And Sarah has recently completed a fellowship with High Country News, specifically focused on climate justice. So we're going to hear a lot from these two today. We'll chat for about a half an hour, 40 minutes, and then I will open things up for questions from all of you, from the audience. So if you've got questions, drop them into the chat, and we've got some people working behind the scenes that will be collecting those questions and passing them through to me. So I wanted to maybe kick this off with a quick story. I recently flew to Colorado from Washington State. And I was having these memories of a flight that I took years ago. It was probably 15 years ago in the waning days of the George W. Bush administration. And we were flying from Missoula, Montana to Denver, straight over the Jonah oil and gas field. And I happened to be sitting right next to one of the, not one of the architects of the George W. Bush energy policy, but certainly one of the enablers of it. And during that flight, we sat and looked out the window at the results of 8 years of opening the public lands to oil and gas development. And it was just this incredible web of roads and pipelines pumping oil and gas out of the ground, and to refineries to get it out to market. It was quite a contrast last week flying from Seattle to Phoenix and looking out the window. Instead of oil and gas wells, as I flew over the Columbia River Gorge, I saw this incredible network of wind turbines. Hundreds and hundreds of these giant wind turbines slowly spinning in the wind. The green energy revolution is upon us. It is very much here in the West. And really interested to get your perspective, you too, on kind of how this is playing out on the ground and kind of what it means for local communities. Sarah, maybe I can kick it over to you first. Climate justice. What is it? And how does it? How is it relevant to what we're talking about today?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be back. I already missed High Country News. And yeah, I mean, as Greg mentioned, I've been, thinking about climate change and reporting on it for the last 6 months through High Country News, and of course before that. And I think kind of the biggest thing, people often think climate justice is kind of implicit in a lot of the climate change stories and climate change policies that are being promoted. But it's, through my reporting, really obvious that in order for climate justice to actually happen, there needs to be, a real concerted effort. And I think the best way I try to tell people what climate justice is like, a story about climate change will often be about greenhouse gas emissions. It'll be about oil and gas development, and it kind of is like a biophysical thing that you think about. Too much CO2, methane in the air, too little things absorbing it, I suppose. And so it's that imbalance, that biophysical imbalance. But climate justice is really kind of looking at the justice and civil rights implications of climate change. So who bears the burden of these biophysical changes, who's actually causing them, how this ties into historic and existing structural inequities, how it will perpetuate them into the future. And just kind of how it's deepening these future inequalities. So I'd say, the shorthand is it's basically climate change plus social justice, as the name kind of implies.
You wrote a story about libraries as climate justice factors. What's the connection?
Yeah, I mean, I think very early on in my High Country News tenure, I there was an act, a bill that was being passed in Congress, Build Back Libraries Act, I think it was called, Build Back Libraries Better Act. And it was, the small kind of, I think they were asking for a small amount of money to basically restore all the libraries in the US. And I was like, I bet I can make this a climate justice story, because I know from my own reporting that extreme heat especially affects people differently. It often affects inner city, BIPOC communities much worse, people who already are suffering from paying too much for their electricity bills, who maybe don't have access to air conditioning. These are the people that more often die or experience kind of really devastating impacts from these heat waves. And so unlike someone who might be in an air-conditioned home where they can afford the utility bills and just switch on their AC, people who don't have access to that are really dependent on public spaces. And one of the few remaining real stable public spaces is the library. So kind of, I made this argument that clearly resonated because, it was probably one of my most shared articles. But I essentially made the argument that, libraries are not just, investing in libraries is not just investing in this public space. It is also a climate justice issue, because everyone deserves to have access to a air-conditioned, cool space that they can kind of have access to during these extreme events that we know are going to get more extreme and worse in the future.
Yeah. And Jonathan, you've been following these issues, in a lot of ways. High Country News has traveled this ground for years in terms of looking at local implications of climate change and other environmental, impacts. Talk to us a little bit about sort of your view of climate change and climate justice across the region. You've been at this for what, 25 years or something?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, I mean, I think, certainly this is nothing new. This whole idea of what's going on with with renewable energy and the way we're looking at it. I think it has to do with looking at things in two different lenses. One is a lens that's looking at the climate. In this case, in some cases, it was air pollution before haze, regional haze, as opposed to looking at it through a local lens. And I think you kind of have to do both, but I think what's happened in the past over and over again is that we look at it through the big picture at the expense of the local. So, I mean, you can go way back to when the Sierra Club, for example, was promoting coal power plants so that you didn't dam up rivers, as a preferable alternative to damming a river because of hydropower. So that's kind of like a weird example, but it's kind of backwards, but it's the same sort of thing. And then if you fast forward quite a bit, I can think about the 2008 Democratic National Convention where I saw this play out almost like on a double screen, because the Democrats, people like Carl Pope from the Sierra Club, he was there, they were giving speeches about how we had to really drill for more natural gas and make it the bridge fuel to renewables in order to get rid of coal. And at the same time, you had sort of smaller or more locally focused groups like the Wilderness Society and the Oil and Gas Accountability Project holding their own things next door, also Democrats, saying, wait a minute, we're feeling the impacts down here on the ground of your kind of climate friendly maneuver. So it's certainly not new. We're facing the same thing now, and I think we risk kind of a myopia if we focus too much on one side or the other. If we focus too much on the local, and we say, you know what, we don't want to have solar panels next to our town because they look ugly, to a certain point, that's kind of counterproductive, and that's not going to do things. But at the same time, if you think only we need to build as many solar panels as possible, we need to cover everything, every flat piece of ground out there with solar panels, then you're going to, a lot of local people and local wildlife and local landscapes are going to pay the price. So I think it's complicated and it's difficult but it's nothing new. And we've been seeing it for a long time.
Yeah. I mean, I think, the thing that has struck me, in recent years is that we're out of time. The scientific consensus is that if we don't cut greenhouse gas emissions by half by the end of this decade and hit net zero by the middle of the century, we're gonna pass that threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in global temperature, and we're already really seeing and feeling the impacts of climate change right now. And there's, I don't know that there is any place where you can see and feel those impacts more than the Western United States. Sarah, you wrote about the latest IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, again, towards the early part of your fellowship. What did you take away from that interview? What's new about the latest science on climate change relative to the last iteration that we saw?
Yeah, sure. And I'll definitely keep it short because I feel like most of the people here today are probably pretty kind of up to date on that, if not maybe even more know more about it. But I think that the biggest takeaway, I kind of asked this question. I asked Amy Snover from University of Washington, who's contributed to a bunch of the IPCC reports. I was like, why do we even, in some ways, it's like, why do we need these reports? What do these reports tell us? We already know it's pretty bad. And she basically was like, what these reports tell us are kind of, they give us more of the precision. And especially with this report, I think the big takeaway was like every, fraction of a degree really matters. So like the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees is the difference between, hundreds of thousands of climate migrants. It's the difference between, the Colorado River totally drying up or still being somewhat functional. It's the difference between, how fast glaciers melt and all of these things. And I think that really hit it home for me, where I was like, it's, it really is so important to, that every degree matters, to like keep it as low as possible. And that even these minuscule kind of changes could make a difference. And I think, this is also the rhetoric talking to some of the folks that look at the green energy transition and renewable energy and stuff like that. I mean, I think that is the big, most people who work in the climate space have a certain, I would say at this point, almost like desperation to them, because they recognize that a lot of the stuff they're doing and a lot of these transitions kind of can't happen fast enough. And then at the same time, there's also the important factor of like, it can't happen fast enough. And if it happens too fast without thinking about how we do it, then we're both going to replicate, all of the problems that exist, and we're potentially going to disadvantage people that have been disadvantaged for decades or centuries from energy transitions, even though they are often the ones that are least kind of responsible for it ultimately. You're muted.
There we go. Thank you. I remember early in the 2000s when High Country News was first beginning to report on the local impacts of climate change, and I was working with Michelle Nyhouse at the time, and we were kind of right on the cusp with the science really being able to sort of pinpoint local impact, and it's fascinating to see the science narrowing down and beginning to see how not just sort of the local impacts and the local implications of continued warming, but also how those sort of minuscule changes could have massive implications for the West. Hey, we have almost 200 people with us today. Thank you all so much for being here. If you're just joining us, this is a conversation with High Country News. I'm Greg Hanscom. I am the executive director and publisher of High Country News, and I'm here with longtime contributing editor Jonathan Thompson and Sarah Sachs, who has just finished a fellowship with High Country News focused on climate justice. You can see us, we cannot see you. If you've got questions for us, drop them in the chat, and we're gonna talk for about 20 more minutes, 15, 20 more minutes, and then I'll just start rolling questions from the audience into the conversation. So, Jonathan, I'm curious, just sort of stepping back for a minute. You had reported quite a lot on how previous energy development has impacted local communities, landscapes in the Western United States. So setting aside the current transition for a minute, any particular stories or insights that you've gleaned from your reporting on oil and gas, on nuclear power, kind of previous energy transitions and development?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot, and like you said, I've done a lot of that reporting on a lot of things, and I think that the main thing I've gleaned is that we have to look both at the big picture and the local picture. And again, another example is with nuclear power. One of the things that I've been really interested in with nuclear power is the way climate hawks are really starting to embrace it as a way to fight climate change. Because it's low emissions, even when the whole life cycle is considered, it's very low emissions relative to almost every other energy source. And you can build a big nuclear plant and it puts out a lot of power 24/7. And so, I did a story a few years ago, I guess now, where I interviewed some of these people, and they're very genuine, and they're definitely environmentalists, and they're very definitely concerned about energy justice. And they really want nuclear power. They want more nuclear power plants. But one of the things that I found interesting is when I asked them about the impacts of uranium mining, they kind of acted like it was news to them. I told them about the impacts, especially to Indigenous people, especially to the Navajos and the Pueblos in the Southwest. And they, the first reaction was, oh, yeah, but that was weapons. And it's true, that was for weapons. But the thing is that it's exactly the same as it's exactly the same process. You still have to mine for uranium. You still have to process it in mills. You still have to enrich it. You just have to enrich it a little bit less for nuclear power than you do for weapons, but otherwise it's exactly the same process. So it has the exact same impacts. So that's a place where I think that the nuclear proponents and the evangelists, I'm not saying that they're necessarily wrong, but I think that they need to factor that into their calculations when they're making these decisions about what to do as far as nuclear power goes.
Yeah, I want to kind of sort of bridge this now to the current transition, and what we're seeing now is an essential and really important shift to wind and solar power, more and more battery powered cars, this kind of thing. Again, we're not going to be able to make this transition without those changes, and these changes do cut a lot in the way of fuel, right? So an electric car is you're not burning gas. Same goes for the difference between a wind turbine and a coal-fired power plant. But these new technologies do require mineral inputs. So, and that involves a lot of rare earth metals, so-called, or green rocks, as you've called them, Jonathan. And no surprise, a lot of those minerals and rocks are found in the Western United States. And this is where we start to get into local impact again. Again, maybe Jonathan, give us a sense for kind of how this is playing out, because it's playing out really in pockets all over the Western US.
Yeah, I mean, electric vehicles are a big one because, so obviously all cars require a lot of mining, they require a lot of extraction to make them. Electric vehicles require sort of different things. For example, copper. Copper goes into everything. We use it all over the place, but it's especially important for electric wires. And electric cars obviously have a lot more electric wires than other cars do because they're electric. And so they use quite a bit. I think, I can't remember exactly what it is, but I think it's like 6 or 7 times as much copper goes into an electric vehicle than into a conventional vehicle. So right there is already a big thing in the West. In Arizona, Mexico, Nevada, you've got copper mines. Those things are going to be, and you've got a lot of proposals on the table for new copper mines, including the very controversial one at Oak Flat in Arizona. Those are going to gain steam because copper demand is going up because of electric vehicles. And that, even if that copper that they're mining doesn't go into electric vehicles, the price will go up because the demand is going up worldwide. So, and that will incentivize their mining efforts. Another thing with electric vehicles is basically an electric vehicle is a chassis with a big battery on it. These batteries are huge. They take up kind of the whole car. They weigh incredible amounts. That's what an electric vehicle is a battery on wheels. And they require a lot of lithium, which we don't mine a lot of that right now in the US. So there's a lot of proposals on the ground, especially Nevada. Somebody asked earlier about the McDermott caldera, which stretches from Nevada into Oregon. And the Oregon side, there's no proposals for mines there right now, but there is exploration. And one company says that it's the biggest lithium deposit in the world, possibly, or at least in the country. And so there's likely to be mining proposals on both sides of that, the state line. You've got lithium proposals in Arizona, and that, again, like any kind of mining, there are definite impacts to it. And so, and then also cobalt is a big material for batteries, and there's very little cobalt development in the US so far. Most of it's in the Republic of Congo. And there are serious human rights violations associated with that. And there's supply chain constraints. So that's another one where a lot of people are really trying to get some cobalt mining going on. And there's a cobalt belt in Idaho where there's one active mine that's just opening up, and there's likely to be more. And then there's rare earth minerals as well, which again, China kind of has the monopoly on those right now. They're necessary for magnets that go into the drivetrain of electric vehicles. And you've got proposals in Wyoming, Alaska, and elsewhere in the West. So, and Mountain Pass in California, right on the California-Nevada border, is, I think, the only active rare earths mine in the United States right now. So I think we can, no matter what, we can expect to see, because of electric vehicles and other renewables, but mostly electric vehicles, we're going to see some mining, additional mining in the West, without a doubt.
Yeah. I want to turn to Sarah here a little bit, because Sarah recently wrote a story about this. This is a little bit different. We're not talking about mining for rare earth minerals, but it is what amounts to a proposal to build a giant battery, a battery that would store renewable energy, and it's also, I think, a really interesting example of how these, how this transition is playing out on the ground, and how we might or might not move forward, kind of keeping local communities and Indigenous folks in mind. So Sarah, describe this contraption for us, if you would. Like, how does this thing work?
Yeah, sure. I think briefly, to kind of set the stage, one of the most important things to know is, in terms of shifting to a renewable energy system, one of the biggest bottlenecks we currently have is storage, is basically the fact that renewable energy, wind, solar, shines during the day, wind goes down substantially at night. So we have all this energy during the day when people aren't using it. And at night, when most residential users need electricity, we don't have it. So we need to store it. And, it is just a huge bottleneck until kind of batteries can actually come to scale and size. And so one quite common, it's a pretty old technique of storing energy, is basically by creating a closed loop hydro battery. So you have a reservoir up top, a reservoir at the bottom, a tube or a tunnel in the middle. And when you have a lot of energy during the day that's cheap, you push the water up to the top reservoir, and at night you can let it flow through for hours on end. And it can produce a substantial amount of energy. This specific system could produce, I think it's around 1.2 gigawatts of energy, which is a huge amount of energy for Washington. Of course, in this particular case, the biggest issue is that the proposed reservoirs overlap with a site that the Yakama Nation have said is a culturally important resource, or a sacred site for them. And so this kind of ongoing debate, or this ongoing kind of conflict that's been simmering for about 2 years, is kind of starting to come to the surface a bit more. And I think, there's lots that you can say about this particular case. I think the point I want to make from having reported on it, and kind of what I think would be relevant to this conversation the most, is, it's the problem that exists is that the structures we have for energy are often based on the fossil fuel energy system that we know has disadvantaged so many communities, especially Indigenous communities, communities of color, all of these folks that have been disadvantaged. I think there'd be very few people that would not be able to point to a bunch of empirical evidence to say, this is an unequal system. And what I said earlier about climate justice needing to be intentional, we haven't done anything to change the systems that exist. So if you are going to build a massive energy plant, storage system, battery system, you're using the same structures that have existed. And I think in this case, you see quite clearly, it's not, the company itself isn't trying to perpetuate inequality or trying to do something wrong in that sense. We just don't have a system that, adequately recognizes treaty rights. We've done a horrible job in the United States of recognizing treaty rights, especially in relation to oil and gas. And so the idea that that would change without any kind of real substantial effort is, obviously fantastical. And I think this case really shows, you need to put a lot of effort to actually make sure that this renewable energy is equitable, and that effort hasn't been put. And so currently it's going in the direction of being as inequitable as, you know, previous energy systems have been.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add to that. I think that's an excellent point. And I think that it's also true with the electrical system that we have in place in our electrical grid, that it was created, you know, it used to be distributed energy when it first started. It was small power plants scattered around all over the place, and they powered a local grid. It grew, became these huge vertically integrated monopoly utilities that started going for huge power plants that were centralized. And they, in order to get more demand, they basically manufactured demand. The utilities did by, first of all, bringing more people into the West, and by pushing things like electric can openers, you know, things that we don't need, but and we're still in that system. You know, we're still in the system where we use huge amounts of electricity. We live in giant houses, and as long as we rely on centralized power sources, or we think we need to. So that's why there's sort of this push to, it's like, no, we got to build a utility scale thing in the desert rather than putting a bunch of individual solar panels on houses, because that's the business model that's in place. And so I think there's two different, yeah, I think it's a great point. We need to change a lot of systems before we can really move forward in I guess, a sustainable and equitable way.
Yeah, and I would, just to bring it slightly back to climate justice, or make a kind of pitch for that again, kind of what you were just saying with the, you know, and someone had mentioned in the comments here, you know, why don't we put solar panels on all of the big box stores, which I think there actually are studies out there showing that it would do a lot if we actually were able to do that. And I think when I look at climate justice stories, and what I've really learned from reporting on them now for the last couple of years is, you know, climate justice stories are often not, you can't see them right away, because the things that people are trying to change don't necessarily automatically have something to do with climate change. It's precisely those systems that you, Jonathan, were talking about. It's like what they're really trying to address is like, why do we have large, you know, investor-owned utility companies? Why don't we have community-owned companies? Why don't we have, you know, community-owned mines or energy companies that are native owned? And so it's just like this way of thinking differently about the systems, because they recognize that changing the systems is what ultimately allows for more or less justice to kind of be continued in them, I suppose.
We have a mountain of questions coming in from the folks who are tuning in, and I'd love to get into those. And we also have 200 people joining us. Thank you so much for being here, everybody. This is a conversation with High Country News. I'm Greg Hanscom. I'm the executive director and publisher at High Country News, and I'm here with Jonathan Thompson, who's a longtime contributing editor, former editor-in-chief, and Sarah Sachs, who has just finished a climate justice fellowship with HCN. I do want to get into, at some point, you know, some talk about where this is being done well, and maybe we could take some questions from readers here first. But I think, given the urgency, given the realities of climate change, and given what we know about what needs to happen to avoid even more catastrophic effects of climate change, we know that things have to change, and things have to change quickly. Maybe let me throw this question at you two first, and then we'll jump into reader questions. Are there examples of where this is really being done well?
I'll jump in really quick. I mean, I think so. There's at least attempts to do it well. One is with electric vehicles. Going back to electric vehicles, there is a company started by one of Tesla's co-founders called Redwood, and it's based out of Nevada, and they are really working hard to recycle EVs, electric vehicle batteries, because there have been studies that show that I think 85% of the materials in an EV battery can be recycled and reused. And so, you could lessen mining tremendously by doing that. There's also efforts by researchers to reuse EV batteries as grid batteries, support batteries, because you don't need you don't need as good a battery or whatever. Like, it doesn't have to be as new to work for the grid as it does for a car. So you've got that kind of stuff going on. In another kind of realm, you've got right now, there's a irrigation district in California that is installing solar panels. They're doing a test project installing solar panels over an irrigation canal. So that will both shade the canal and reduce evaporation of water, which of course is getting more and more scarce. And it will also generate power without messing up public lands or anything like that. So, you've got a lot of examples of brownfields being used for solar or wind, farmland. I think there are a lot of examples where things are going well. There's also a big, huge boron mine in California where they're trying to recycle, trying to get lithium out of the waste rock, which would require no new mining. And also in California, under the Salton Sea, they're trying to do some project where they're drilling for geothermal, and they're able to get lithium out of the briny wastewater from geothermal. And those are not without their own impacts, of course, but at least it's trying to produce power and get the geothermal at the same time. So, and I do think that there are some efforts in the right direction for sure.
Sarah, kind of looking at this specifically with an environmental justice lens, in your readings, have you come across green energy efforts that really have done well in terms of taking into account the voices and perspectives of local communities, environmental justice communities, Indigenous folks?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, we kind of had this discussion previously a bit about, things that work well are like good, I always say are like good public health initiatives. Like, no one kind of looks at them and no one gives them credit because they work. And so, but I have come across some examples more than anything of really just, ways to broaden the stakeholders that come together to decide early on a project. I think, in so many cases, a lot of these conflicts around the siting of wind or, solar or hydro happen because the people that are invested in them, will make decisions about where they're from. And then, there's lots of studies that show you get, you invest a certain amount of money, you become really attached to that specific place you want to put something, and you become a lot less flexible in your ability to negotiate or your willingness to negotiate. And then you kind of have these conflicts that could often be settled if people have buy-in from the get-go. And so Stanford has something they call the uncommon dialogues, which bring these diverse stakeholders together around certain themes. They had quite a famous case, I believe, in Oregon with hydro dam management, where they brought the local communities and tribes and dam managers to the table. The Washington State University Energy Program also has something they call the least conflict solar siting pilot program, where they similarly are working with small communities to kind of figure out where everyone gets to decide where the best place is to put solar. And I think that's what it comes down to, because to some extent, if we need to expand renewable energy, we need a lot of land to do it. And, it should be the case that people have better kind of deciding power on where that is. And I kind of do think, and you can see when people come around the table, you can actually find solutions that then have less resistance.
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of parallels here again with just public lands management for years, and whether it's a timber sale or an oil and gas lease, that early community involvement and early community input will save you a lot of grief down the road, because you're going to be able to see where the issues are and the problems are. Well, let's dive into some questions, because there are some good ones here. For folks who are just tuning in, you can put your questions in the chat. We have a lot of them. We've got about 20 minutes left. I don't think we're going to get to all of these, but I'll start throwing your questions in the mix, and forgive us for being a little slow and not being able to hit every one of them. Related to this recent conversation, so Emily Tang writes, she's referring specifically, Sarah, to your story about Washington State and the deal that Jay Inslee who's sounds like a supporter of this project. In a recent bill in the state legislature, there was some language that would specifically require consultation with tribes related to treaty rights that in areas of what is now Washington State. Inslee vetoed that language at the very last minute. It was seen as a real betrayal. And Emily wonders how we can get Western figures to accurately represent the needs and wants of the oppressed.
So I'd say if I had an answer to that, I probably wouldn't be a journalist. But I think it's it is kind of a super important question. And I think ultimately, in the case with Inslee, a lot of that, his kind of move, ultimately the short story of it is that tribes are trying to get language about consent into the Climate Commitment Act in Section 6, which would give them more power to essentially veto projects like this that they thought encroach on their resources in unjust ways. And that would be a step up from the current consultation. Consultation, you have to take into consideration everyone's thoughts, but you don't actually have to really do anything with it. Whereas consent, you actually have to get consent from people in order to go forward. And Inslee vetoed that quite literally at the very last minute. And people from most of the tribes were absolutely enraged. In part because they believed that he had done that to get them on board so the Climate Commitment Act would pass, and then kind of toss them off in the last minute. And I think it's kind of an interesting case though, because what you ultimately need, depending on where you stand, is a kind of more diverse conversation to happen, and you need these spaces for those conversations to happen. And I think one of, completely not related to green energy, but to a different story I was doing about climate change and farm worker justice, I think they have really had this interesting place where they've been able to bring farm workers who are experiencing climate change into conversation with Washington legislators and NGOs and civil society organizations. And that's really been able to change things. And I think with the green energy issues that are coming up, I do think spaces like that where you can actually hear the voices of everyone and have a space to hear those complaints is really necessary, and that kind of doesn't exist. So I think kind of making a way to have that be possible, I think would be a first step to having politicians kind of take responsibility for all of their for all of their people.
Yeah, we've got a comment, another comment from Tim, who is a gosh, I don't want to get this wrong, a wild horse and burro advocate, again, feeling that in this case, federal agencies are not responsive to the voices of the people. Jonathan, any models that you have seen out there that really, that put the voices of the public at the forefront or the center of decisions like this?
For public land management, it's not really. But there have been efforts. So like in California, there's the Desert Energy or Renewable Energy Conservation Act, I believe it was called, where it's sort of like a master plan where they try to get everybody together ahead of time and come up with areas that they thought were appropriate for development and areas that they thought should be preserved for wildlife and Joshua trees, that sort of thing. And, they came up with a reasonable compromise so that you're not reacting to proposals all the time. Instead, you've set these things out in advance. And, there's differing opinions about whether that worked or not, or whether that actually took in all the concerns or not, but it is better than, I think, than the process that was there. And similarly, the Obama administration tried to create master leasing plans for oil and gas. But, and that was the same thing on a smaller scale, which was to go be ahead of time and say, these are the areas that we're willing to see development. These are the areas that we're not. And these are the areas that you can have development, but they have to have a lot of restrictions on them before you actually lease the land out and kind of gave away all your rights. And the Trump administration got rid of those and they went away. But that's an idea where it could work if done correctly, and you could extend it to renewables as well. So I don't know a lot of examples where it's worked really well so far, though.
It was, that story of flying over the, Wyoming, the oil fields in Wyoming. One of the ironies of that scene, sitting next to this official from the George W. Bush administration, was that they had pushed a lot of that energy development under what then Interior Secretary Gail Norton called the 3 C's. And you're doing better than I am if you remember what they are, but it was collaboration. It was all about, it was collaboration, conservation, and something. And so they used this notion of kind of working with local communities to push what was a massive industrial agenda across the Western landscape. And I think that obviously creates huge trust issues, and no one but Indigenous folks or environmental justice communities feel this more strongly. I think going into this green energy transition, it would have been nice to at least have a baseline of trust. And I think, unfortunately, that's really lacking, and for very good reason. Thoughts on, I'm looking through, we have so many questions, and I'm going to try to kick a few off here. Okay, here you go. This is actually a great one from Dan Kimball. Thanks, Dan, for this. Are you concerned that the focus on changing systems to rectify climate justice issues will delay achieving CO2 reduction, which needs to happen in the near future to stave off the worst effects of climate change?
I mean, just to answer that quickly, I would say that changing systems is probably the only way that we're going to rectify climate change. Big systems, as I was talking about the power system, for example, maybe even the capitalist system, if you want to go that far. I personally think that just trying to build more clean energy isn't gonna cut it. It doesn't seem to have done much so far. We've built up huge amounts of solar and wind over the last decade or two, but at the same time, we're still burning more. We're still using more power, and we're burning. And when I say we, I mean the nation as a whole, the United States. We're using more power, and we're burning just more and more natural gas. So yes, we're burning a little bit less coal, but with each passing year, which is awesome, it's great, that's wonderful. But at the same time, the natural gas consumption is going up, even as renewables go up. So I just think that we need to do something different, and I think it needs to be a systemic change, probably.
Yeah, and I would maybe add to that. In some ways, I would say, I am concerned in that sense. I think there is a real trade-off that a lot of environmental justice communities are really feeling, that the more urgent climate change gets, the harder it is to kind of push through some of these systems that actually distribute the resources and kind of solutions and the power more equitably. And in many ways, you know, there's also an argument, and so there's also studies that show, you know, if you were to have just a super authoritarian government, you could, you know, you could pass a lot of these changes, but you're then also giving up a lot of things. And so I think there, you know, the other side of this is, you know, unfortunately, equity and kind of sustainability are often not necessarily matched, but a lot of people point out that, you know, a lot of the solutions that we're proposing come from a very limited kind of pool of people who are proposing them. And once you broaden that pool out, you include Indigenous knowledge, you include knowledge from, you know, previously kind of more oppressed parts of society, you also have kind of more creative, more imaginative solutions to a lot of the problems we have. And I think that is kind of an unintended effect of actually, you know, creating more equity and allowing more people to have a say in what our future looks like going forward.
Yeah, back, Jonathan, to what you were saying earlier, you know, we are kind of moving into this new transition on the industrial scale. And it's going to require large scale, it's going to require small scale, it's going to require sort of every creative idea we can come up with if we're going to get there.
Yeah, I think so.
Question, this is a good one from Pete Sandrock, who says, how would you distinguish legitimate local voices from knee-jerk NIMBYism? Should local opposition be afforded veto power? I think that is a great question. And again, it gets back to, you know, so many stories High Country News has told over the years about mining and ranching and logging. What's the difference?
Well, I mean, you know, I think this, in some ways, this goes back to the thing with Jay Inslee and the veto power. It's just an example of where this can get super complicated if you do give some local group veto power. And this is with the Chaco buffer zone that Deb Haaland, Interior Secretary Haaland, is proposing to ban basically oil and gas leasing in a 10-mile radius around Chaco Culture National Historic Park. And a lot of local Indigenous activists are in favor of this, and they actually want much bigger buffer zone than just 10 miles. But the Navajo Nation itself has actually come out in opposition to it because there are allotment holders, Navajo allotment holders, who actually get, when their land is drilled, they get money, they get royalties. And they oppose it because although it doesn't apply to allotment lands, it could isolate them. And a lot of times those are pooled together with public lands. So it could hurt them economically. And so there's a case where you've got this conflict between actually a lot of the residents who live around there who are Navajo against the Navajo Nation itself. And you've got this conflict within. So there, if you give somebody just veto power just like that, then you're going to have to veto that in this case. Whereas if the Navajo Nation Tribal Council makeup would change a little bit, maybe it would change a little bit as well. So it can get super complicated and messy as far as that goes.
Yeah, and I think I was going to say, it's a fantastic question. You know, it makes me actually think of also a lot of the reporting High Country News has done about the kind of form of gentrification also happening in Wyoming and Montana, with a lot of kind of relatively well-off outsiders buying up housing stock. You know, would they be considered local? Would they have a say? Their interests probably wouldn't reflect longtime residents' interests who kind of live in those places. So that's not to say that I have in any ways an answer to that, but I do think that's a really relevant question. I think in some cases, for example, when you look at you know, Native tribes, that is pretty well set in treaty rights. You know, the United States has over 300 treaties that they signed with different Native American and Alaska Native groups around the United States. So, you know, those aspects of like who is local or not is pretty well set. But as for everything else, I do think that's a really important and will probably become a really relevant question if people actually do decide to try to get more local input.
Yeah, I think that question of treaty rights is absolutely essential and really important to recognize that Indigenous folks have a very different set of rights than folks who've arrived more recently. That in your story, Sarah, there is the Yakima Nation has treaty rights over, is it a third of what is now Washington State? But the question is, will the state or federal government really recognize those rights and take them seriously? Jonathan, excellent point. This stuff gets really complicated in a hurry. We are, I guess maybe I'll just sort of end it on this note, which comes in from Annie Stratton. She says local means all voices, not just those with local power. I think that kind of brings us back to some points that you were making earlier in the conversation, Jonathan, about sort of the balance of this balancing act that we have to play right now between local, national, regional interests. We are in a situation right now where we have to act, and we have to act quickly if we're going to avoid some of the worst impacts of climate change. And when it gets down into the dirt, when it gets down to the local level, it's incredibly complicated and incredibly hard to do. I hope this has everybody thinking about ways that we might move forward as a region and as a broader community, and involving more voices early on, recognizing treaty rights, recognizing the importance of action, and the importance of avoiding the mistakes that we've made in the past, where the impacts of this kind of development falls upon communities that are least equipped to handle them. Really interesting conversation, you guys. I really appreciate it. For folks who've been tuning in, and we had 200 people tuning in today, thank you so much for being here. I hope this is just the beginning of the conversation. We have been capturing all the comments that people have put into the chat box during the last hour. We're gonna read through these, and this is gonna be great fodder for us, good grist for the mill. So thank you for that. And thank you so much for supporting High Country News. I'm sorry to end this conversation now because it really could, we could go for another hour or two. I'd love to bring a few other people in on it. And we will do that. We're going to be doing these conversations once a month for the foreseeable future. Join me a month from now with author and longtime HCN contributing editor Michelle Nyhouse. We're going to talk about her book, Beloved Beasts, and the future of the conservation movement. Really looking forward to that. So again, gratitude to all of the folks who support High Country News and our work. Gratitude for all the students who joined us today. It's been great to have you. And more than anything, I really hope that this conversation today has you thinking and you talking, and looking forward to what you can do to making the West a better place. That's what we do. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Jonathan. And thanks to the whole crew. Hope to see you all soon.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in.